Welcome and good afternoon to a terrific event today. We are thrilled to have with us Robert Zoellick, who has served in a number of distinguished positions, perhaps most prominently and certainly most recently as president of the World Bank. Prior to that, he was U.S. trade representative in the Bush 43 administration, and in the Bush 41 administration served in both the State Department and the Treasury Department under Secretary of State James Baker and formerly Secretary of Treasury James Baker in the Reagan administration, including as Undersecretary of State for International Economic Affairs. Bob is with us today on his new book, America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. It is a terrific read and also a great book, which is not always the same thing. It is a sweeping account of American foreign policy going back prior to the founding period and almost all the way up to the present, which is something we'll get to talk about, Bob. We're also delighted that this is part of a class. So this is a new webinar for us, for our regular webinar viewers who have been such a great source of energy for all of us since COVID hit. We're adding a new dimension today. You are actually in the classroom. So along with Bob, my two fellow teachers, David LeBlanc and Todd Sexer, are with us today in a class called Democratic Statecraft, which is a new part of UVA's Democracy Initiative. So you are also joined by about 30 first-year students at UVA, who you will not immediately see on screen, but when we get to the question and answers, we're going to draw them in. This is a semester-long course that is part of a 2-year course of study that Todd is heading up that explores issues in democracy and foreign policy, including, but most importantly, and exactly on theme with Bob's book, the actual art of statecraft, not just how foreign policy works, but what it feels like to operate foreign affairs in a democracy. So Bob, welcome. It's a thrill to have you with us. Thanks for joining.
Well, thank you, Bill. I'm really delighted to be here with you and with David and Todd, and thanks for Christina. And I especially appreciate the opportunity to meet with some of your students, even if only virtually.
It's great to have you. So David, I'm going to hand this over to you. David and I together are going to have a little bit of a conversation with Bob here at the outset. We'll draw Todd in and then we'll start drawing the students in. So David, over to you. And I'm sorry, I forgot to introduce David, who a number of you have seen in these webinars before. David is a faculty member with us at the Miller Center and in the politics department and in the Batten School. He studies international economics, transnational issues, from migration and refugees to now infectious diseases, among other things, or at least David's been part of the teams that have been helping us at the university get our arms wrapped around these complex global challenges, of which Bob himself has had a lot of experience. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Bob, for joining us. Bob, Bill kind of gave away part of why I'm so excited to have you here to have a part of this discussion. As somebody who works in the space where we think about international economic policy, we think about economic growth, and especially in a COVID environment, we think about what's on the other side. The role of the World Bank, in my eyes, looms large, and that's something that we'll get to by the end of our conversation. But I wanted to kind of begin very broadly. As Bill indicated, this book is sweeping both in terms of its historical picture, but also the breadth of diplomatic efforts that you cover. And so I'm wondering if you could at least tell us as we begin, why did you write this book? What audience or audiences were you interested in having a conversation with?
Well, again, thanks for the invitation, and I look forward to talking about the World Bank and the other topics. But as you mentioned, when I was in government, I always thought about the issues that I faced with the context of history. And I thought that the book might be a way of encouraging others, including students and the upcoming generation, to try to consider that approach. Some of you may recall that in the 90s, Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy, where he used history to talk about foreign policy. When I read the book, I enjoyed it greatly, but I had a sense it was written somewhat from a European realpolitik perspective. So for a number of years, I was thinking, how might I approach this challenge from sharing the American experience and some of the American ideas? And so the approach that I took, as you and Bill mentioned, was to focus on stories, and particularly on people, because I figured it might appeal to audiences interested in biographies or multiple biographies. And in particular on problems and how to try to deal with particular episodes and solve the problems. As many of the people on this event will know, many foreign policy courses these days are taught through the prism of international relations theory. And Bill actually was an expert in that. It's an interesting way of approaching questions. I think it's good for intellectual discipline. But what I wanted to share with people is that in my experience, when I face problems such as German unification or NAFTA or global climate change or Darfur, the theory was of limited use. And I wanted to try to explain to people in a way through the prism of, I guess you could call it, case studies. So each chapter I try to focus on the key information for people to understand what was going on. And I do add my own sort of assessments based on my experience, but I'm trying to encourage others to ask themselves, so what would they do? And also, when you deal with a book of this length, you have to really enjoy the subject matter. And I always enjoyed diplomatic history back from when I was in college or even before in high school when I'd read it. But as people may know, it is somewhat faded as a field, in part because the understandable urge to bring in unappreciated actors and perspectives, and that's been useful. But I think we've lost something. Fred Logevall, a historian at Harvard, wrote a piece in the New York Times saying, why have we stopped teaching political history? Now, I must say, UVA is one of the sterling sort of counterexamples. The diplomatic history professors and program that you have at UVA, I think is, one of the top in the country. But you'll find fewer of those these days. And then I suppose the last point was, when I was in various executive positions, I used to torture my colleagues by asking them historical questions because I really didn't know how much they knew. And I discovered that insofar as they had studied some history, it really was from World War II on. And part of the purpose of this book is to revive the first 150 years of American history, because there's some wonderful people and some very important insights.
So let's think about the use of history and the use of cases. I think that your motivation really speaks to a lot of what we try and do in the classroom, and how oftentimes when we think about specific instances, we say, oh, this is like this other example. But I'm wondering if you can be your own harshest critic. By focusing on cases, we often get sucked into thinking about the particular as opposed to the general. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about how you weighed in your writing of this book, weighed the focus on detail at the risk of an inability to generalize, or whether you think there's still the ability to generalize from some of these cases.
So some of you may know that Ernest May, a great diplomatic historian, and Richard Neustadt, a political scientist who worked in the Truman administration, wrote a book titled Thinking in Time. And it's a little technical, but it's got some very good insights. And one of the insights about applying history to policy is the danger of using analogies. And indeed, in my book, I focus on this in the case of Vietnam, and you can think of it perhaps even in more recent cases, including in the two Gulf Wars. But what they counseled, and what I always found to be the case, was that it's most important to think about history in terms of asking questions. And so, if you think about it, if you're presented with most problems in life, you probably want to know what's been tried before, how has it worked, and what have we learned from the experience. In international relations, you need to know, what are the countries that are involved and what are their historical perspectives, because they will bring that background to the task. what are the institutions that are involved and what are their history? Because in practical diplomatic work, you have to operate with institutions and processes, or else you're going to create new ones. What are the people involved and what are their histories? Because they will bring attitudes to this. And how have circumstances changed? And that's obviously important. And vitally important, what do you want to accomplish? What do you want to get done? What are the problems that you want to try to solve? And I suppose one of the values of history is that it's a multidisciplinary field. So what you're really bringing to bear is concepts of politics, economics, military power, technology, science, all different aspects of looking at a problem. And in that sense, it's probably like area studies. We're in area studies is another field that I think has somewhat past its prime in the academic world. And I think it's a shame because area studies like history leads one to integrate. And of course, I always found that a deep dive into history will remind you that messy facts sometimes dominate theoretical structures. You really, in each of these cases, you understand sort of the real problems that people have to deal with. And on the positive side, I think history can offer insights on how to do better, as opposed to an acceptance of timeless obstacles. So one of the encouraging parts I found at a time where many people are feeling a little down, I've gotten some reaction from professors using the book that found that their students actually find it to be more hopeful because it shows you can try to deal with problems. And just again, to give you a personal sense, I took a lot of history when I was in college. I'd studied a lot of US and European history on my own before. So I added a lot of history of Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union. And I recall actually thinking when I was going to graduate school to kind of put myself in the shoes of people like Sergei Witte or Stolypin in Russia right at the end of the imperial era, before the revolution. And they were trying to do an economic modernization program. And I was trying to think, you know, what would I have done? How would I have sort of dealt with this challenge? And in some ways, that's a useful way of thinking about issues. in reality, it came back in sort of 1989 and 90 as the Soviet Union sort of broke up. So I'm trying to encourage people to think about history as a way of adding perspectives and asking questions, as opposed to sort of finding a direct analogy or a simple toolbox.
That's really helpful, especially because sometimes we worry about getting not bogged down, but as you said, you know, we want to deal with the messy facts, but we want to be wary of the dangers associated in using an analogy, to your point, and I think that's really helpful. The other thing that you do in the book that I think is really quite interesting is that you discuss and categorize in ways that I haven't seen before what you refer to as these 5 traditions of U.S. diplomacy. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, what the rationale was in terms of thinking about these traditions, but also why these analytic categories you think are useful and important. But before I ask you to answer that question, let me just remind folks in the audience that there is a Q&A box. And if folks who are outside of our class in the audience have questions, please put them in that box and we will try and integrate those questions as we move through the seminar. Thanks. All right, so five traditions of U.S. diplomacy.
So I wanted the stories to stand on their own, but I thought it was appropriate to give some framework. So I try not to be heavy-handed with it. But in some ways, the 5 traditions are useful as you think about issues confronting the United States today. So the first is North America. And this is always an interesting surprise to some people, because if you go on the Council on Foreign Relations website and others, you'll find sort of reports on Europe and Asia and the Middle East and Latin America and some on Africa, but very little on North America, except one that David Petraeus and I did together. And obviously, North America was at the heart of American foreign policy in the 19th century. But even in the 20th century, if you reflect on, we almost went to war again with Mexico in 1916. In 1917, the Germans had the bright idea of encouraging Mexico to declare war on the United States. And after their presumed victory, they would recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. For some reason, they left out California. Um, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the great nuclear showdown in the Cold War is in the Caribbean, right off our southern shores. But also, as you think about the issues that the American public is interested in these days, there will be topics such as immigration, narcotics and drug trafficking, environmental questions, economic integration, and those all go to the heart of North American policy. But even more, I came across a speech that Ronald Reagan gave in 1979 as he launched his presidential campaign. And you almost couldn't imagine this today. He makes the point that the United States would be better off if Mexico and Canada were stronger, and that it was time that we stopped thinking of our nearest neighbors as foreigners, which is a little different than the rhetoric you hear today. Now, he had something bigger in mind, and this was the basis of the report that David Petraeus and I did, and frankly was the heart of some of my work with NAFTA and others. And that is, in addition to thinking about the relations among these three countries, think about North America as a continental base in dealing with global foreign policy. And the stronger the continental base, the stronger we'll be in operating with China or Europe or other parts of the world. 500 million people, 3 democracies, energy self-sufficiency, and ability to export, better demographics than the rest of the world if we can treat human resources as a plus. And so the North America policy really needs to be seen in a global context. Second tradition is to focus on trade, transnationalism, and technology. And what I have in mind here is trying to bridge the trade foreign policy gap and underscore that trade from the very start of the United States was more than a matter of economic efficiency. In fact, it was our first foreign policy because we were in a world of empires and mercantilism, and it was a way of prying open relations. Now, as part of that, the American founders were trying to open the door for private parties. So for people who study transnational relations, your work on immigration and others or humanitarian issues, this has been a key part of American foreign policy, not only the state, but also how you open doors for private actors. And technology development has also been very significant. And I have a chapter on it for a man named Vannevar Bush, who kind of helped develop science policy after World War II as an example of this. Then the third is alliances. And here, for the first 150 years, America stays clear of alliances. And you can really almost describe America's international relations as ways to interact with the world without alliances. This was based on Washington's warning against entangling alliances and Jefferson's, or permanent alliances, and Jefferson's warning about entangling alliances. And then, frankly, quite accidentally, from 1947 to 49, we create a unique alliance system that has guided U.S. policy for 70 years. And the question today will be, where do we go with that? Then the fourth one is the importance of Congress and public support for foreign policy. And this is often overlooked by foreign policy specialists. George Kennan, for example, when you read his descriptions of his work with Congress, you can see why they never let him near the Hill, because it would have been a disaster. But it allowed me in the book to bring out the importance of people like Vandenberg, or in a more modern era, people like John McCain, or Lugar, or Nunn, and the critical need to, in a democracy, to have the support of public opinion and how leaders shape that. And then the last one was America's purpose. And I consciously avoided the term exceptionalism because frankly, it creates a lot of frustrations with others around the world. But my point was, from the very founding of the United States, Americans saw the country as having a larger purpose. And the best little anecdote I can use to explain this to people is, for those of you that still carry a wallet, someday take it out, see if you have a dollar bill, look on the back, and you've probably never paid much attention to the Great Seal of the United States on the back. But you'll notice this unfinished pyramid with the Eye of Providence above it. Now notice, it's unfinished. There's more work to do. And below it, it says Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So they were thinking in rather big terms. Now my point is, the concept of this purpose changes. So in the early period, it's simply to preserve a republic in the world of empires. Then it's to preserve the Union in the Civil War and to deal with slavery. Then by the mid-20th century, it becomes more of sort of, as a rising power, how do we play the balance of power mediating role, which Teddy Roosevelt did. For Woodrow Wilson, it's to make the world safe for democracy, not necessarily make it into democracies, but make it safe. Then for Franklin Roosevelt, it's the Four Freedoms, the Atlantic Charter. And the Cold War, it's the United States as the leader of the free world. For Bill Clinton, after the Cold War, it's the indispensable power. So my point here is this will evolve and change, and I think it has sort of three components. One is it depends on the external environment and how the U.S. faces it. Second, there's always a focus on small r republicanism or freedom or liberty, but the third point is it depends on the external environment and public support for kind of what your agenda is to that.
That last comment gets at where I was going to take you, which is to draw you out a little bit, since this is a class on democratic statecraft, and we've been trying to understand both the domestic democratic context of foreign policy making, as well as the global international purpose. Just give us a minute or two more on that. And just to prompt you a little bit more, I was struck in going back through my marginal notes from when I started reading the book earlier in the fall. Early on, in the very first chapter about Benjamin Franklin, you talk about a number of different things that he drew from, or you drew from his experience, but one of which is that domestic politics of peacemaking is frustrating, that you've never known a peace treaty that didn't leave both sides unhappy. Let's talk about that, both the domestic forces and increasingly, as there are more democracies around the world, how that makes it harder, easier, better, safer, more desirable, less desirable.
So for those of you that have seen Hamilton, this is a observation that is posed to him by one of his colleagues in the negotiation. The one, I'm just drawing a blank, his son had actually was a colleague of Hamilton's and dies late in the Revolutionary War. And the idea that is saying about whether the American public will show their gratitude. And Franklin, as you said, recalls that he's never seen a peace that people aren't complaining about, but he actually uses the biblical reference. And he said, blessed are the peacemakers, probably refers to the next life as opposed to this one. And the points you raised, there's two really sort of separate but related points there, Bill. One, throughout the book, I try to emphasize this importance of public support. So Alexander Hamilton actually has a strategy in some ways that previews the Anglo-American relationship of the 20th century. And it's one that the Lord Shelburne, the British Prime Minister at the time, also had, but neither of them could sustain it politically. So it takes another 100 years to develop. When Thomas Jefferson is negotiating over Louisiana, he has to deal with congressional opinion and the frustration about having the Mississippi closed. And he uses this as both pressure with Napoleon, but he also manages it quite carefully. He sends Monroe to Paris because Monroe was beloved by Westerners and trusted by Westerners. And then in the mid-century period, for example, when Teddy Roosevelt is doing these mediations of the Russo-Japanese War or the first Moroccan crisis, he's very careful because the American public doesn't want to get drawn into European affairs. So it's a question of kind of how far he pushes things. And so at each stage, you can see one that's very important, in some ways has a parallel today, was after the disappointment of World War I and Woodrow Wilson's failure with the League of Nations and the Versailles Treaty, how Charles Evans Hughes very shrewdly sort of creates a political momentum for naval arms control related to regional security issues in Northeast Asia, a topic we still have today. And he does it by capturing sort of some of the disappointment, but also the budget attitudes towards naval arms control. And so my boss, for example, for 8 years, James Baker, was partly skilled because he was very effective at getting things done with Congress. So I think it's one of the aspects of to have a successful foreign policy is to have it sort of rooted at home. As for the broader international connectivity, I think in some ways, John Quincy Adams, who I refer to as an American realist. I got the phrase actually from James Traub, who did a wonderful biography of John Quincy Adams. is often referred to by people in the realist community as someone who focuses simply on power and means and ends because of the famous speech he gave about not getting drawn into escapades around the world. He was thinking about the revolution in Greece. But the reason that I refer to him as an American realist was that he also had a very strong commitment to the belief in republics. And at the time, he was skeptical whether they would take root in Latin America or that matter for Europe. But his belief in the importance of that as a political guiding light is very strong. He's not just a pure European sort of realpolitik thinker. And I think much of the 20th century experience is, when and how can the United States support the spread of these institutions? As David knows, it often is linked to economics. The alliance agenda then becomes part of this. At times you have movements that probably try to stretch too far, and whether this is the question of people dealing with Iraq or Afghanistan or an earlier point, sort of Vietnam. So this brings you back to what we call the messy facts. These are judgment calls about sort of how you can help sort of create the conditions. When does it lapse into nation building and become too great of an adventure? When are you creating the fundamental possibilities for people to govern themselves in the future by giving them a helping hand?
So I'm going to see if Carter Singrani is a student in our class and he has a question.
Hello. Yes. So my question is, how do politicians and global leaders today utilize a strategic dialogue, as you mentioned in your first few chapters of your book?
It's actually quite rare. and people often throw around strategies, and one of the hot topics in some universities is sort of grand strategy thinking. You have to be careful how you define the term. Sometimes it's a post hoc explanation of what people are doing. The way that I've tended to think about it, as the book suggests, is that most officials are trying to think about the problems they're trying to solve. Rise of China, North Korean nuclear program, Iran, narcotics issues. But it's helpful to, in the way I would call it, sort of connect the dots, see how the pieces are interacted. And in that sense, to have some sense of strategic framework, which even in the most basic form, I sort of give in the five traditions. But I think you'll see sort of allegedly strategic papers come out of administrations, because Congress sometimes dictates that the administration do a national security strategy or the Defense Department do a national defense strategy. But part of my caution to you is you have to be very careful to see whether the words in the pamphlets are connected to the reality of how policy is being constructed.
That actually prompts a question for me quickly about you. We're sitting here thinking about a number of different issues that you've helped manage. The NATO alliance when the Cold War was ending and Germany was reunifying. The economic agreements that came together, the economic support that came together for the Gulf War, or your leadership at the World Bank. When you come into a situation like that, if you are problem solving, are the problems obvious, or do you look at a series of problems and say, this problem's more important than those three problems? How do you do that assessment and weighing?
Well, I believe it's very important to anticipate, which I distinguish from being able to sort of foretell for sure, to predict. Prediction is very hard, but anticipation, which is based on having some sense of events and trends, I think is quite important. But let's make this practical. So to take your case of German unification and to go back to, what was it, Carter's question about strategy. This was a combination of a historical strategic perspective with a good feel for facts on the ground. So from the historical strategic perspective, we were focusing on what historians might refer to as the German question. So since 1871 and the unification of Germany, you have this very powerful state in the center of Germany, or center of Europe, without clearly defined borders. We went through 2 world wars, then we divided into 2 Germanys. And so in 1989, when you could start to feel the ice of the Cold War breaking, we wanted to support a democratic German unification, but we put it in the context of the success during the Cold War of having Germany linked to NATO and at that time the EC, later the European Union. So we had a strategic concept about the importance of that alliance. And from a historical perspective, that's important because many of the studies you'll see focus on the U.S.-Russian relationship at that moment, which was important in the relation to Gorbachev. But what they overlooked was that our first strategic aim was to succeed with Germany and the alliance. We thought if we got that right, we'd actually be better in position to deal with Russia and others in the future. But at the same time, you had to have a good sense of the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground was that the people of Germany, East and West, were creating a momentum for unification. And that momentum, if thwarted, could have led to a crisis. Goodness knows what would have happened if it looked like the 4 powers or European other countries had tried to stop unification. And as people may know, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France were not enthusiastic about the prospect from the start. But at the same time, you could use that momentum to force Britain and France and the Soviet Union to come to conclusions about how unification would take place. And that brings you right back to this notion of a strategic outcome of a unified Germany and NATO. One other point which I mentioned, which is to make this happen, you needed a process. We didn't have one that you could readily take, so we created one, the 2+4 process, where you take the 2 Germanys and the 4 powers. And that, in a sense, served as a steering group for trying to deal with all the other issues you had to get clear if Germany was going to unify. A new conventional forces agreement, changes in NATO, the development of the CSE process, economic support for Russia. So in a sense, that little story allows you to combine a problem, a situation on the ground, but with a strategic overview. So I think, I mean, in some, Bill, I think this is where a historical perspective will give you a sense of what that framework might look like, but you obviously have to customize it and adapt it for new circumstances. And we could talk more about this. With the World Bank, you know, this is an institution created in 1944. Its original purpose, remember, was reconstruction and development. So it's supposed to be, the first loan was to France. And so its role changes as the world economy changes and the nature of private capital flows change. So the nature of multilateral institutions, of course, has to evolve with circumstances.
So let's talk about that a little bit, Bob. You know, one of the things that intrigues me when we look at the history of the multilateral institutions that were created after World War II, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, NATO, all of these were built with, you know, one can tell certainly 3 stories that are not inconsistent with one another. It was to rebuild Europe, it was to stabilize alliances, and it was to restrain the Soviet Union. What I'm wondering is, to what extent, when we think about those multilateral institutions, and let's even think about those institutions from 44, 45 until the end of the Cold War, to what extent was there a implicit or explicit mission having to do with the furtherance of democracy, of spreading democracy through multilateral institutions and organizations? And then we'll take, you know, post Cold War to the present.
So there are a lot of questions packed in there, but let me try to take it into pieces. What may surprise people, but it's Ben Steele's books on the Marshall Plan and the IMF on Bretton Woods are very good on this. I have a chapter on it, 1947-49, was that the United States doesn't start out with a plan to create alliances. In fact, we want to avoid a military commitment, but after George Marshall comes back from Moscow and sees that Stalin wants to try to take advantage of the sort of breakdown of Western European economies, comes up with the idea of the Marshall Plan, in part to avoid a military tie. But the second observation was the Marshall Plan wouldn't work unless you had Germany. Germany was a big part of the European economy. So if you recreate Germany as the Federal Republic of Germany, which was done in this time period, 1949, you create a new issue, which is that for France and the other countries in Europe, it gets them anxious. That's one reason you create NATO. And obviously, it also led to the break with the Soviet Union. You have the Berlin crisis, and so you have to create a security shield for Western Europe, and that, of course, leads to NATO. This was not planned. These were events that, in a sense, were triggered, but as you're kind of saying, they had, in a sense, the historical perspective of the 1930s. But again, something that most historians or most histories don't really focus as much on is that even within this period, they're having to adapt. So, David, you probably know this well, but the IMF and World Bank are created in 1944. But in a sense, the assumptions of that creation turn out not to hold quite quickly by 1946. So number one, they're assuming that the U.S. will be cooperating with the Soviet Union. They're assuming that there'll be a pasteurized Germany that'll have a dismantled economy. That was the Morgenthau Plan. They're assuming a safe receding of the British Empire. And they're assuming that trade will come back and you can use the IMF's balance of payments management to sort of deal with the issues. By 1947, none of those assumptions are true, which is why you have to go forward with the Marshall Plan. Now, that doesn't mean that the IMF and World Bank go away. It means they have to adapt to the changed sort of multilateral circumstances. And to weave in the political question that sort of Bill asked, one of the other little favorite accounts I have in here was, as he mentioned, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs of Trade, was created in 1947. A man named Will Clayton, who's somewhat faded from history, but I try to retrieve as part of this. In 1947, he's negotiating with 23 economies, and Congress passes a 50% wool tariff. And the Australians, heavily dependent on wool exports, say, if this becomes law, we're pulling out of the deal. And if Australia pulls out of the deal, then Britain, as the leader of Commonwealth, feels it has to pull out. And then the European economies say, well, if Britain pulls out, what's in it for us? So Clayton goes all the way back home in 1947 to have 15 minutes with President Truman to discuss the wool tariff. And and Truman also gives 15 minutes to the Secretary of Agriculture. And we've probably all been in meetings like this. So the Secretary of Agriculture says, Mr. President, if you don't sign this bill, you'll lose up to 7 states in the 1948 election. And poor Will Clayton has to make the argument for allowing an international economy to form with a new set of rules and openness. And Truman, to his credit, the next day tells Clayton he's going to veto the bill, and he even authorizes a 25% cut in the wool tariff. So GATT and the international trading system go forward. And what I remind people that don't know their political history, Truman did win in 1948. So all these things are sort of interconnected as you go forward. Now, you made a point about connection with democracy. And I think the important distinction here is what we were just talking about is economic multilateralism. And there's a similar discussion on the alliance side. That can help support the basis for democracies. Recall what the Marshall Plan did is it sort of created an economic recovery. It also creates the notion of supporting political systems that's based on middle class, rule of law. But it doesn't necessarily mean that all multilateralism has to be with democracies. This is the current debate. So today you would have to ask yourself, are we ever going to really be able to deal with biological security issues such as pandemics or climate change without dealing with China? And China is not a democracy. And so part of our debate is, can you have cooperation with China and under sort of what terms? I'm a bit of a contrarian on this. I believe that while there are challenges with China, that there are examples that you can actually accomplish an awful lot with China if you go in with your eyes open on different things. So when you think about multilateralism and democracy, one has to be a little careful here, because also in the international environment, some countries will say, oh, democracy, each state should have one vote. Well, going back to the political support in the United States, if an island country has 20,000 people, one vote, the same as the United States with 315 million people. But then you could also ask China with 1.4 billion people. So democracy as a term, has to be carefully connected to the notion of legitimacy of political systems.
Okay, so you said my question had a lot of pieces. That answer can take us in, infinite number of directions. I wish we had, another 6 hours. I want to go back to the World Bank, right? And so thinking about your leadership of the World Bank and the evolution of the World Bank during the time you were there, but really take us to the present moment, the COVID moment, and not just the health piece, but the economic development piece. I mean, what we've seen from COVID, and not to minimize the human toll, but we see a world economy that has basically come to a halt, right? Maybe that's an overstatement, but emerging markets, developing countries, what's the role of the bank? What's the role of multilateralism to help restart efforts at economic development? I mean, we know that poverty is increasing massively. We know that food insecurity is increasing massively. The situation for hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the world, because of restrictions on trade and investment, are far too large to count. And so I'm wondering if you can give us a sense, be prescriptive here and even hopeful. I want hope about what do you think the World Bank could or should do to help with post-COVID recovery?
So when I was at the World Bank and I tried to explain it to audiences around the world, I'd often start by saying people are often confused because it's called bank. And therefore, they think it has something to do with lending money, because at least that's what banks used to sort of do. And I would try to point out that the World Bank does have financial means, and there are different types. Some are loans, some are grants of concessional financing for the poorest countries. There's a private sector arm, there's guarantee arms. But in an average year, maybe there's 50 to 60, in a big year, 70 sort of $1 billion of support, which is not, those aren't small figures, but in the larger world of international finance, as you know, these are sort of drops in the bucket. So I would then try to explain that what the World Bank is really about is trying to share experience and knowledge about the challenges of development. Its financing programs should be designed to offer demonstration effects. So not only the one project, but what you can learn from the project. And by the way, the Chinese who started to engage with the World Bank in 1980 were very avid users of pilots, which they would study quite closely and then expand through other mechanisms. Then there's assistance with building the institutions of a market economy. This flows back a little bit to your democracy question, the critical role of institutions, rule of law processes. And you have to focus on the macroeconomic part. That's the fiscal and monetary policy. So you've got sort of inflation under control, basic conditions for growth, but there's also issues of rule of law and competition, and critically, creating the context for private investment, because private investment is the fundamental driver of growth. So again, to give you a real life example, when I came to the World Bank in 2007, I had sort of a crisis to deal with because my predecessor had been deposed in kind of a staff revolution, which isn't that common in international civil services. But so I had to kind of get people focused back on the job. And I identified 6 themes. And in many ways, those themes would still guide you today, but they'll give you an insight on the challenges of the work. One, the poorest countries in the world, such particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but elsewhere, they have special needs. Second, I focused on fragile and post-conflict states. So, and these not only have security implications, but they often drag down their neighbors. And this is a special combination of issues of security, economics, and governance. Third, I focused on middle-income countries. And this is key because from a pure economic outlook, people say, well, why are you helping the middle-income countries? Your resources should all go towards the poorest. But my logic was in terms of sharing information, experience, sort of growth tactics, that the roles of the Brazils or Indias or Colombias or Perus or Chiles, those are important. And also, I want to connect them into this international multilateral system so they also share responsibilities. They're also going to help deal with issues from pandemic to climate. The fourth is the public goods agenda, environmental issues, trade, financial sort of questions, health questions. Fourth, I put a particular focus on the Arab states. This was before the so-called Arab Spring, because from my experience, I could see that there was money there, but there were some big institutional problems that had to be dealt with. And the sixth is what I'll call knowledge development. And again, let me be more specific about this. Shortly before I was at the World Bank, Mexico had started a conditional cash transfer program called Oportunidades. And for about 0.5% or 1% of GDP, they focused on the bottom 15 or 20%. It was a direct cash transfer, but the conditions were that children had to be sent to schools and women had to get health checkups. Probably did more for women's health in Mexico than anything in the history of the country. And it was quite successful. And we then tried to share this experience with other countries. So the Bolsa Familia program that was done in Brazil, which actually has been very successful under the current government, but we expanded these to some 45 different countries. And what was important was to recognize is when people asked us about instituting a program, we didn't just give them a textbook or a paper. You could connect them with people that had actually sort of done the real life program. So it's important to understand kind of how the bank is a catalytic player. And that brings me to specifically the question you're focusing on, which is cooperation with other multilateral institutions. So in 2008 and 2009, Americans will remember the global financial crisis, but there was also a big food price crisis. So at the bank, I worked very closely with the UN food agencies. I got some pushback among my staff. They said, look, we're a development institution. We're not a humanitarian institution. And my response was, you know, if you can't live through the week, you're not going to have much chance for development. And so similarly today, it's quite interesting you asked this, David, because obviously there's going to be a focus on the WHO and vaccines. But the real challenge in much of the developing world is going to be, how do you distribute those vaccines? It's a logistics challenge. It's cold storage and refrigeration challenge. It's working with national healthcare systems. It's working with local community health operations. Frankly, the WHO just does not have this capacity. So one of the things that I hope will happen through the G20 or perhaps with the help of US and other players is you'll meld more the work that the WHO does and Gavi with the Vaccine Alliance with the work of the World Bank. But I would even go further. If you think about, for example, the development banks and the World Bank, one of the things I discovered was as we were trying to fight corruption, we had programs that would sanction companies that had violated the rules. But when I checked with my friends at the Inter-American Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank, they had separate programs. So somebody might violate my rules, but they could still do business with the other banks. So I created a network so that if they were thrown out by one, they're thrown out by all. So these are sometimes the complex mechanics, what we'll call them the messy facts of how you actually have to make these systems work. And if to give you another one that sort of may be appealing to some people, I've always had an interest in wildlife conservation. So one day, one of my colleagues pointed out there were only about 3,500 tigers left in the wild. And so we formed a sort of a global tiger alliance with the 13 tiger range countries with conservation groups, scientific groups. But what the World Bank was bringing that conservation groups did not have is I could go to prime ministers, I could go to the finance ministries, I could go to the development ministries, the anti-trafficking groups. How do you pull them all together? And actually, I worked with President Putin. I think he might have been Prime Minister Putin at the time, and we pulled together a summit with all the tiger range countries. And we had national action plans done by the countries which we could support. So whether it's health, corruption, trade, or others, what's important is this point earlier I said about connecting the dots, or as I also referred to with a sense of history, how do the institutions really work? You can write a nice piece to say what should be done in an opinions piece, but how do you actually sort of connect the dots to make things happen?
Thanks. So we have about 10 minutes left and we have not talked about China yet. So let's do that. Demond Morris, a student in our class, has a question about China. Demond.
Thank you. With China's economic power and influence on the rise, and the looming threat of trade wars with the United States, how would you advise the United States to respond diplomatically, whether that be through peace or trade deals or military persuasion? And how might that response change if China were to surpass the U.S. as the largest economy by GDP? And would this be a threat to liberal democracies and future diplomatic relations between democracies and non-democracies?
So
And
that's
Bob,
going
let me just throw in to add a level of complexity to the triple flip that Demond has just asked you to do from the high dive. To add a twist to it, Stephen Crowley asks, any observations on the South China Sea, either conflict or solution?
So Demond, your question is obviously going to be one of the big ones, particularly for your generation, but for all of us sort of going forward. And I guess I'd start by saying that what's most important is kind of what we do at home. So if not only in terms of our economic recovery and how we deal with the pandemic and the strength of our society or our science and technology development, but fundamentally, are we going to compete as a more open society or a closed society? So some of my differences with the current administration's approach is they try to imitate what China does in closing things off, and I think America's strength is its openness. The second would be, U.S. has been most effective when it works with partners, whether as allies or as sort of other economies that may not be former allies, whether these are on security and deterrence issues, such as the South China Sea, or whether it's on questions sort of economic sort of rulemaking. Third, I alluded to this, where some of the conventional wisdom today has been that cooperation with China failed. And I wrote a piece in the National Interest in March and April of this year, if you want to look at more. It's not too long of a piece, where I give quite extensive detail of why that's just factually incorrect, whether it's from proliferation policy, economic issues, environmental topics. And it's not to say all that is well with China. It's more to say that the work of diplomacy is never done. But if you start with the assumption that cooperation with China doesn't produce things in mutual interest, I think you're going to find yourself on the wrong path. And so what that would mean on some of the economic topics, for example, would be the Trump administration focused on the bilateral trade deficit, which is, your economics professors will probably tell you, is a pretty meaningless number. And frankly, they haven't changed it anyway. And the overall deficit has gone up. But in doing so, their first phase trade deal was basically a managed trade purchase deal, as opposed to trying to focus on the rules. And this is, again, where it gets you back into messy facts. If you take an issue like intellectual property rights, China has now created intellectual property rights courts where foreigners are winning about 85 to 90% of the cases, but the penalties are too low. So I would push to get the penalties higher. Another big problem has been forced technology transfer. That's prohibited by their WTO terms, but it's hard to get the evidence in cases. So I would be pressing to remove the joint venture requirements that China has, because those are almost a temptation for forced technology transfer. And I could go from Belt and Road on to other issues. There are a series of topics. Some of these, by the way, are going to be very much in China's interest too. For example, the state-owned enterprises that Xi relies heavily on are frankly less efficient than the private sector. But if they're going to have them, we need to have disciplines to allow competitive neutrality or ability to offer counter responses. But in talking about these interests, whether security, economic, or environment, I'm not suggesting that the U.S. cedes the high ground of values. No, for example, in dealing with Hong Kong, rather than sanction some of the leaders of Hong Kong, I would do what the British have proposed, which is to say, let's allow some of the people from Hong Kong to come to the United States if need be. That'll be a way to distinguish free societies from unfree societies. It also creates a wonderful example in the world about the choices. So in dealing with China, you have to think of at home, partnership, larger picture, but there will be areas where we, as I mentioned, here's a good one from today, biological security. Look, if you start out by saying, oh, China, it's the Wuhan virus, we're going to blame you everything that's gone wrong, and we're going to indict you, I don't think you're going to get much cooperation. On the other hand, the people in China don't want this to repeat, and there's always the likelihood we're going to get more of these viruses. So could you approach this in a way where we're trying to get at the bottom of the cause of it, try to prevent it, but without trying to just clobber the Chinese sort of from the start? That's kind of what diplomacy is all about, you know. And if you take a position where you're going to have a pure confrontation with China, then don't be surprised if they don't cooperate with you on Iran or North Korea or other issues that are important to you. So that's, again, sort of connecting the dots.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Let me wrap a couple different questions together that have come in from the audience. Tracy Tomey asks, how can history aid us in muting internal partisanship and polarization in our foreign policy? Daniel Baruch, who writes from Baylor University down in Texas, about the difficulties of repairing our own faults domestically. I mean, let me put it in the following framing. You've written often critically about one Trump administration policy or another, even the president's own demeanor. If we are in a post-Trump world, in a Biden presidency, is there a way of crafting a foreign policy that has broad-based public support? One might argue that part of President Trump's appeal when he was a candidate was failed war in Iraq, failed international engagement on one thing or another, had caused America to turn inward. It was Donald Trump. It was not Donald Trump who was saying America first. It was the American people. Is there an agenda out there that embraces public support so that you can get past the polarization that the Trump presidency has driven?
Yeah, that's great. And that's the real question for today and the future. So let's start out with a few facts. Sort of as students, it's always useful to kind of dig to find out kind of what the underlying basis is. And I commend you, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs did a recent report. They do one of these, they do an annual survey. And the numbers are somewhat striking about Americans' international attitudes. The support for America's international engagement is about 66% versus 30% that think we shouldn't be active. Support for NATO is about 73%. Support for trade is sort of in the 70s and 80s, and sort of, is it good for the economy? 82%, consumers 75%, even for jobs 59%. And interestingly enough, a desire to reach out to allies, even if we have to adjust our position somewhat. Now, these are general survey numbers, and so I would consider those sort of inchoate public opinion. But my point is, you sometimes think opinion leaders, in a sense, have lost faith in America more than Americans have lost faith in America. That's sort of the general opinion it can be framed on this. And here, I'll give you another historical reference. In October 1945, so this is the month after the war with Japan has been ended, Gallup did a poll that asked Americans, how important was international affairs? Was it a vital interest of the United States? 7% said it was vitally important. This is in 1945. And in the next year, it rose up to 14%, you know, and this is, again, a message of the challenge that Harry Truman and his administration had in sort of reframing things. Now, to bring it to today, and this is where I want to combine the domestic with international. If former Vice President Biden is elected, he's going to have a huge domestic agenda. He's got pandemic and frayed healthcare system. He's got inclusive economic growth. He's got racial issues. He's got environmental issues. He's got immigration issues. And students of the American government know there's only so much a president can get done at once. My boss, James Baker, when he was chief of staff for Ronald Reagan, told Reagan in 1981, Mr. President, you have three priorities: economic recovery, and economic recovery. And the point was, you have to get some points on the board to be successful here. Today, I would actually think it's sort of a combination of pandemic, building trust, and economic recovery. But while Biden, of course, is experienced internationally, and he'll be interested in some of those issues, the reality is, how much time will he have to spend, particularly if he's got to work with Congress, which is probably one of his strong suits on sort of this agenda, and it's going to be limited. So my suggestion, but this builds back to our conversation about multilateralism and alliances, is that you would leverage the domestic agenda internationally. So, for example, if you do something, if we have vaccines and you're focusing on the pandemic at home, don't just rejoin the WHO. but take an initiative like David and I were talking about to sort of push the development institutions to kind of help the WHO in the developing world. Maybe do something like Bush 43 did, where he had this initiative for HIV, AIDS, and malaria, which was a game changer for Africa. On carbon, if you do something at home on carbon, don't just rejoin the Paris Accord. Try to broaden the coalition by having an initiative, for example, on soil carbon in Africa, which would help with agriculture, but also help with carbon. Avoid deforestation, adaptation. There's a whole range of things you could do to regain momentum. If you do something on immigration, maybe starting with the Dreamers, connect it with your Mexican agenda, as I mentioned, sort of with North America. Now, if you take each of those items and then ask yourself, that would be a pretty good agenda for discussing with your allies in Europe and Asia about the foundations for a new thinking on security, not to the exclusion of traditional questions like nuclear proliferation or conflict or cybersecurity. Data would be another key issue, but as a way of sort of starting to restore partnerships. And based on that foundation, we turn to the two biggest issues, the future of free societies and the rise of China, which we've talked about. So if you notice what I've done there, I've tried to connect dots. I've tried to connect the domestic politics with the international politics. I've connected with alliances. I've connected with multilateral institutions. That little example, in a sense, is representative of the larger challenge that we've been talking about for the past hour.
Well, and I think you actually did more than that, Bob. I think you helped us think about how we can connect past experience and learning from the past with and cases with helping us make good policy or better policy as we move to the future. Let me thank you on behalf of my colleagues
for your
and
students.
my class.
In the spirit of anticipation, what I just gave you is the essence of an op-ed I've written for the Financial Times. They told me they'll print over the next week. So you guys can all follow it in the Financial Times. You're ahead of the game.
When we see it, we'll forward it to everybody. But let me thank you for taking your time and for being just so engaging in having these conversations with us. The book is terrific. This conversation has been really outstanding. So on behalf of the Miller Center and the Statecraft Lab, Bob Zoellick, thank you for joining us.
And good luck to your students. The future's in their hands.
Thanks. And on behalf of the Miller Center, I also want to thank our terrific team that pulls this together every week. Christina Lopez Guittardi Chow, who keeps us on message and on schedule. Howard Witt and his whole communications team that manages webinar technology brilliantly. And to David and Todd Sexer, who has pulled together this class, which has been a real joy for me to teach this year. So Bob, thank you for joining all of us again.
It's my privilege. Good luck.
Okay, take care.